Part 4. Wow, part 4 already. So I did warn at the beginning that there was a potential for this to get kind of long and rambly. But this is getting longer and more rambly than even I had anticipated. I thought maybe I'd do 2 or 3 parts and then have it covered. Here I am on part 4, and I'm really kind of only halfway through my notes. So clearly I have some pacing issues. No, seriously, I've got a lot of pacing issues. It's kind of humbling to reflect that I've seen other YouTube videos kind of cover the same ground in about maybe 15 to 20 minutes. Here I am kind of 90 minutes in, still kind of fumbling around. So, yeah, at some point I'm going to have to rethink my processor, maybe not do these rambling videos anymore and try and kind of edit what I want to say and be more succinct. Anyways, kind of self-criticism aside, here's what I think I'm going to do kind of moving forward. This is going to be the last video I do on the history of anarchism. If I'm not through by the end of 30 minutes is when my camera automatically shuts off. Then whenever I don't get to, I don't get to. I mean, you know, it's not like that information is not available in other places. So this is going to be the last video on the history of anarchism, and then I'll do one more video kind of giving my own personal thoughts on maybe the pros and cons or the reasons for or against anarchism as a philosophy or an anarchist society. I'm very much aware that even this much is pretty self-indulgent. I mean, we're already 90 minutes in here, right? So probably the reasonable thing to do would just be to stop now. Say, okay, I've talked for 90 minutes, that's enough. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and just be self-indulgent more, I guess. But just a reminder, nobody is under any obligation to watch this. Sorry. Okay, that being said, I guess just plunge right back into it, huh? I think when I got cut off last time, I was talking about the ideological makeup of the Paris Commune. So, despite being kind of heavily associated with both Marx and Bakunin, Paris Commune was kind of a revolution on the ground that was unplanned and spontaneous. There were elections afterwards, but there wasn't any kind of clear hand guiding this. Now, the makeup of the government of the Paris Commune, most history books I've read have described this as Jacobin. Jacobin meaning the political ideology. Now, the Jacobins, of course, were the radical faction in the French Revolution a century earlier, in 1793. You know, Robespierre and the Reign of Terror and all that. But what the Paris Commune was 1871. So what does a Jacobin political outlook mean in 1871? I'm going to be honest here. I'm not entirely sure. It's evident that the radicals in the Paris Commune were very much looking back to 1793 and were romanticizing it, and I think they brought back a lot of the same institutions. Even the name Paris Commune comes from the original French Revolution in 1793 or 1789, or somewhere in the original French Revolution. They brought back the Committee of Public Safety. I think they brought back the Revolutionary Calendar. So they were looking back a lot. And yeah, other than that, I'm not really sure. This is one of those things I'm a little bit unsure of. Friedrich Engels, in his preface to one of the editions of Marx's The Civil War in France, calls them Blanquists. Blanqui was another school of French socialism at the time. He was big in France. And again, what is a Blanquist exactly? I'm going to admit I don't really know here. They were Blanqui was very much a believer in insurrection, and he had kind of very hierarchical organizations, and he was big in 1848, and he was big in the lead up to the Paris Commune, and that's really all about I know of him. Again, another good book to read on this is Revolutions of 1848 by Priscilla Robertson. Anyways, I guess the point being, whatever you want to call them, the majority of the Paris Commune was not Marxists and they were not anarchists. There was a minority though, and the minority is socialists and is frequently described as Proudhonist socialists. I find it interesting that all of the history books I've read, they never describe them as anarchists. And I think this maybe goes back to what I was saying earlier, that Proudhon was, although he called himself an anarchist, he was maybe more in the socialist tradition. But yeah, it was a generation of French socialists that were kind of influenced by Proudhon, and they made up the minority. The minority in the Paris Commune kind of consistently voted for social measures, like kind of stuff that would improve the conditions of workers. Other than that, they were kind of consistently more moderate or more conciliatory than the majority. So the Jacobin majority was kind of for armed confrontation with the Versailles government, for taking hostages. As far as I remember, the Paris Commune never officially sanctioned the execution of hostages, but there were some people in the Jacobin faction who went rogue during Bloody Week, the end of the Paris Commune, and did some executions on their own initiative, and that again comes from the Jacobin faction. So the minority is kind of, again, this was before the split between anarchists and socialists. Paris Commune was 1871. The split in the Working Men's International between the Marx and Bakunin didn't happen until the following year in 1872. So I think this is one of the reasons why both Marxists and anarchists kind of take their legacy from this faction. An interesting book I read on this, The Fall of Paris by Alistair Horne, which is otherwise an absolutely brilliant book on the Paris Commune. But Alistair Horne does have a bit of a conservative bent, and he talks about the minority. He says, I'll just read the quote. He said, "The most fundamental split in the Commune so far had taken place, and henceforth its assembly would consist of a majority and a minority faction. The one, controlled by Jacobins, wanting to exercise dictatorship and terror, the methods of '93, and blaming the failures of the Commune upon the sentimentality of the socialists. The other, desiring to govern by reasonable democratic methods, to observe moderation, in order to leave, as Rochefort put it, the door at least half open to conciliation." And then he goes on to say, "In light of the 20th century history, it seems perhaps ironical that the exponents of democracy and moderation should have been chiefly the internationalists, the forefathers of Lenin's Bolsheviks." And I guess in a way they were kind of the forefathers of Lenin's Bolsheviks because they were the socialist faction. But they were also Proudhonists. So they were kind of more the forefathers of maybe the anarchist faction of the internationalists, which may have been why they were a lot more moderate than we associate with Lenin. Anyways, all of that is a long way of saying that there was a minority faction, but the government of the Paris Commune was not predominantly Marxist and it was not predominantly anarchist. But anarchists do kind of look back to the Paris Commune for a few different reasons. One is that, if you go back to the revolutions, the previous revolutions, right? The French Revolution of 1789, or the French Revolution of 1830, the French Revolution of 1848, they happened in Paris, but the government asserted control over the whole of France. In some cases, whether the whole of France wanted it or not. I mean, you think back to 1793, right? There was a revolutionary government in Paris. Some of the provinces wanted nothing to do with that revolutionary government. So then there was kind of fighting in the provinces to establish control. What happened in 1871 is that there was a revolution in Paris, and they said, look, we'll just govern Paris. We'll just be concerned about kind of how Paris works, and you other French cities can kind of figure it out for yourself. So that's kind of a very anarchist model of organization. Organization at the city level, or they called themselves the Paris Commune, but I think that it was much larger than what we would associate with a commune per se. Now, the other thing which both Marx and Bakunin picked up on is that the Paris Commune had delegates. I mean, they had elections and they elected representatives. But these delegates were at all times recallable. So if you're living in a district and you don't like what your delegate is doing, you can recall him immediately. I mean, you have to have the vote and stuff like that. But the delegates are always able to be recalled. And the other thing, I talked about how Marx had warned against the revolution at this time, but this was a spontaneous revolution, which I think was more kind of in Bakunin's model than in Marx's model. There were a number of other spontaneous revolutions in other French cities around this time. Bakunin himself took part in one of them, which was in Lyon, I believe is how it's pronounced. And I think that might have been the year previously, in 1870. But there were a number of other revolutions kind of concurrent with the Paris Commune in 1871. Now, Marx's name is very closely associated with the Paris Commune. And he wrote like a brilliant defense of the Paris Commune called The Civil War in France, which is worth reading no matter where you are in the political spectrum. It's kind of a brilliant piece of reporting and polemic. But the Paris Commune lasted for about 2 months before it got crushed. And Marx and Engels were very slow to do anything until right up into the last minute. And this was something that was noted on at the time. People were like, okay, come on, we got to do something, we got to do something. And Marx and Engels were kind of very slow moving. This has been remarked in a number of books I've read on the Paris Commune. Paris Commune, Revolution and Reaction. I think one of their essays was very critical of Marx's delayed response. Another biography I read of Marx, and this is by Isaiah Berlin, says that Marx was deliberately dragging his heels on this because he knew that the revolution in the Paris Commune was more along the lines of Bakunin's model than his own. And so he was either very slow to praise it or he was deliberately trying to sabotage it. It's interesting though, and I noted this in my review of that book, I'm not quite sure where Isaiah Berlin gets that from. And Isaiah Berlin is, one of the most respected political scientists of the 20th century. So I don't want to say he's just, making this up or a hack or something, but he doesn't really cite where it comes from. And I've never really heard anyone else say it, at least in quite those words, that he was deliberately trying to drag his heels because this was Bakunin's model. But whatever, that's his opinion. The other thing, I guess, we're talking about the Paris Commune is Louise Michel, who was not a member of the Paris Commune. I don't think women were actually allowed as delegates in the Paris Commune. And again, my Trotskyite friends, who always love to attack me on this, might say this is because of the influence of Proudhon. Proudhon was kind of very anti-women having any authority. But Louise Michel kind of was very prominent on the ground, organizing. She was there at the initial uprising. She was always kind of there at the barricades and kind of everywhere there was action, she was there and gained a reputation for herself. She would later associate herself with the anarchist movement. And I don't think she was an anarchist at the time. I think this was when she came back from exile. She threw herself into the anarchist movement. And I think, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, the reason was, again, during the time of the Paris Commune, was before 1872. So 1872, again, was when Bakunin and his followers were kicked out of the International. So I guess there wasn't really a separate anarchist movement to align yourself with at the exact time of the Paris Commune. But after the Paris Commune, she was very prominent in the anarchist movement. Again, a good biography to read of hers, if you're looking for a book recommendation, is Louise, Michel by Edith Thomas. The Paris Commune was crushed at the end of 2 months, and it was very brutally put down. I mean, the Versailles troops came in and just massacred not only kind of everyone on the barricades defending the Paris communes, but in the working class areas, they just kind of, anyone who was young, like early, in their 20s or whatever, they said, okay, he's probably been on the barricades, shoot him. Anyone who is kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time, just kind of mass massacres of the working class areas, and of course all the radicals. And it's been suggested that this brutal repression of the Paris Commune is kind of what would later create the violence in the end of the 19th century. And somebody who kind of makes this point explicitly is Alex Butterworth in his book, The World That Never Was, a true story of dreamers, schemers, and anarchists. He makes a direct link between the repression of the Paris Commune and the terrorism that happened in the 1880s and the 1890s. Speaking of which, I guess the next thing to talk about is that in the 1880s and 1890s and kind of early 1900s, anarchist movement became associated with terrorism or with assassination. So this is a time when anarchists are throwing bombs or when they're doing assassinations of people. It has been referred to as propaganda of the deed. I forget who coined the term propaganda of the deed. I don't think it was Proudhon or Bakunin or Kropotkin. Proudhon and Bakunin were dead by this time. Proudhon died, I think, in 1865. Bakunin died in the 1870s. So by the time this new wave of violence is going off, it's kind of a new generation of anarchists. The phrase propaganda of the deed refers to the idea that, that at this point there's all this anarchist literature out there, right? So Bakunin had written all this philosophy. But I guess the average person is not going to sit there and read through all this philosophy books. So if you want something that's going to attract like the non-readers to anarchism or kind of spread the message, you've got to be out there kind of doing stuff, and the doing stuff becomes a propaganda instead of like all this literature. And unfortunately, doing stuff kind of took the form of assassination. Now, in theory, these assassinations were supposed to be targeted at very specific individuals. So, for example, I think the president of France and like the king of Italy, like kings and queens, I guess primarily kings across Europe were kind of vulnerable during this time, because anarchists hate kings. I think like presidents and prime ministers would also be targeted by anarchists. And there were a number of assassinations during this period. But there are also some political violence which makes a bit less sense. So there were some anarchists, I think in France, who let off bombs in cafes. I guess they're going after the bourgeoisie, like the whole middle class is the enemy. But yeah, really, this did not make any political sense. I mean, sorry, I don't want to phrase it that way because that makes it sound like the targeted assassinations made some degree of sense. I'm against kind of violence full stop. But yeah, definitely kind of setting off bombs in cafes is kind of alienating everybody at that point. So, I don't want to be patronizing by kind of going over the obvious, but I guess you can't be too careful, so I'll go over the obvious maybe. This is a problem with kind of violence in any political movement, is because the kind of people you're going to attract to your movement are going to be unstable people who are more in love with the violence than they are in love with the political ideology. So even though like the idea was like the, you know, kind of assassinating the king of Italy was going to show the world what anarchists was and kind of bring people into the cause, the kind of people it was bringing into the cause were not really the kind of people you wanted. People who were more in love with the violence than with the cause, and you know, people who were not well mentally, yeah. So this was not a good point for anarchism, and it's you know, the movement could have easily just kind of died out here. It's kind of a miracle it didn't, but it kind of found its roots again and made its way, kind of got away from the violent assassinations and kind of more back into organizing in the unions and the working class. But yeah, there was a period there, 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, where there was a wave of assassination and terror kind of associated with anarchism. Yeah, which brings me maybe to anarchism in the United States. So anarchism in the United States, I believe, came over with kind of a lot of these European immigrants who were bringing kind of anarchist ideology over from Europe and were involved in the working class and the labor unions and the organizing. There are a few big events. One is kind of the Haymarket Affair or the Haymarket Massacre in Chicago. So there was some sort of, I don't remember actually, some sort of union rally. People were giving speeches and somebody threw a bomb. And to this day, nobody knows who threw the bomb. Could have been like an anarchist, could have been an agent provocateur, could have been, who knows? But a bomb went off, a bunch of people got killed or injured, and then the policemen just kind of responded by firing wildly into the crowd. Then they rounded up the organizers, put them on trial, and just kind of found them guilty of the bomb. And whoever ended up throwing that bomb, I think it was pretty obvious that the kind of 8 people who got put on trial for it, who were kind of union organizers, had nothing to do with that bomb. And I believe either all of them were anarchists or maybe 4 of them were anarchists. Sorry, I'm getting my facts a little bit hazy here. Some of them were anarchists. And yeah, and they ended up getting hanged for this. And they were kind of big martyrs to the anarchist cause, and this was a big impetus for the anarchist movement to kind of, it was a radicalizing influence. Emma Goldman, in her autobiography, talks about what a big impression this made on her. Speaking of Emma Goldman, a great book is Emma Goldman's autobiography. It's called Living My Life. So check that one out. But yeah, Emma Goldman was one of the anarchists during this period. And she and her lover/partner, Alexander Berkman, I think first made their mark with the attempted assassination of Henry Clay Frick. So there was a homestead strike that was going on. So again, this was kind of a union strike. They were striking to try and improve their working conditions. And Henry Clay Frick, who was the steel mill operator, brought in private Pinkerton detectives to try and break the strike. So the Pinkerton detectives are essentially like thugs. So they come in to try and terrorize the strikers. So there's all this violence going on, and the strikers are being attacked, and it's a pretty awful situation. And it's making national news, and Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman are absolutely outraged by this. So they decide they're going to assassinate Henry Clay Frick. And this goes back again to the propaganda of the deed, which is quite popular during this time. Now, accounts seem to differ on this a little bit. I remember reading, actually, in one of my history textbooks, I think this was one of my political science textbooks, that Emma Goldman raised the money to kind of get the revolver for this by going out and by prostituting herself, like sleeping with men for money. Emma Goldman herself says in her autobiography that she attempted to sleep with men for money, but she was so bad at it that she was out kind of in the bar trying to solicit customers. And somebody said to her, "You're pretty new at this, aren't you?" He said, "Here's some money, just go home. I can tell you're terrible at this." Yeah, I've got to think Emma Goldman would be in a position to know, wouldn't she? I mean, like, who else would know? I mean, it's not like there were reporters following her around at this stage, right? This was when she was still kind of a relatively unknown, when she was kind of a complete unknown. So I'm thinking you've got to go with that version, right? I don't know, whatever. But Emma Goldman was involved in this conspiracy. Alexander Berkman goes in to try and assassinate Henry Clay Frick, and he misses, or I think just hits him in the shoulder when he fires, and then he tries to stab him, but he doesn't succeed in killing Henry Clay Frick. But there is this dramatic assassination attempt. And so that catapults them into the limelight. Alexander Berkman ends up going to jail for like 20 years. The police are never able to prove Emma Goldman's involvement in it. So she stays out of jail, but she goes on to, become a very famous anarchist organizer and orator, and speeches and stuff like that. But yeah, one of the things I mentioned way back in part one, kind of attending this conference with this Trotskyite group, in which they're listing kind of all the terrible things anarchists have done. And this was high on their list, because what ended up happening is the union who was leading the strike did not ask for this to happen. Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman were not associated with the union. They were kind of outsiders who just kind of traveled down because they had read about this in the paper. And because of their assassination attempt, it was actually terrible for the striking workers, because public sympathy had largely been for the workers up until this point. And then there was an assassination attempt, and all of a sudden public sympathy turned against the workers, and then public sympathy was all for the owners. Like, oh, these poor owners are getting attacked by these vicious anarchists. And it ended up killing the strike, really. And yeah, the point he made, the Trotskyist guy made, is he said, this was completely undemocratic. There was no democratic organizing principle in which there was discussed and voted on by the people who were organizing the strike. They just took it into their own hands. And I thought, yeah, I mean, that's actually a really good point. This kind of history of kind of anarchist bravado action, propaganda of the deed, is completely undemocratic, which is ironic in a way, because, the anarchists' philosophy is for a kind of direct democracy state, but anarchism in practice throughout has really been undemocratic in the way it's often been practiced. And this, of course, goes back even further to Bakunin, who was in love with these kind of secret conspiracy groups. So yeah, that's an absolutely legitimate point. Now, to be fair, Emma Goldman goes some way to realizing this herself.